Hello all, this is a process video walking through some steps of editing a model shot. This was taken with my iPhone last week, one of the models in our studio, and I wanted to just talk about some of the editing techniques you can use after taking model shots outside of the lab, but using Photoshop to kind of get a little bit further along, get a little more detail, a little more focus, being able to rotate and crop, and play with the various exposure tools that are available in this incredible program. So I've got Photoshop open, and I've got a model photo open as we see here. And so one of the first things I'm going to play with is the fact that I've got the warm concrete, the warm chipboard, and the warm basswood. I don't think it helps me or hurts me, but I don't think it really helps me to have it be in color. It's a bit dull, doesn't really contrast too well each other. So instead I can really make this about shadow of the frame and plane, really see the sort of crisp edges of the basswood against the sort of texture of the concrete. So one of the first things I'll do is I'm going to play with these masks down here, and I'm going to first set up a black and white overlay. And what you'll see is this actually didn't edit the photo itself. It's a layer on top. And so if I use some of the presets here, I can, first of all, I can try an auto feature, right? Click on auto and see, okay, what it did differently. Not a ton of difference, but I also have some presets up here. And so what I might play with in this scenario, since I don't have a lot of extreme colors, you're not going to see a bunch of differences between the filters. But if you notice, that yellow filter really did brighten up parts of this image. So the yellow filter is this sort of layering on top of certain aspects of the color, the yellows in the field. And then same thing you see with red, you're not going to see a big difference. When you get to skies and other things in larger architectural settings outdoors, red can be really dramatic because it makes the blues of the sky quite dark and really rich. So I'm going to use this yellow filter to start. And like I said, to sort of play with contrast, you can see the blue makes it really a lot of texture and detail, but actually, in my opinion, a little duller, giving you maybe too much detail for this image. So I'm going to go with this yellow filter. And then another thing I can play with is the idea of brightness and contrast. And again, brightness, contrast, this is again on top. If I turn these off or one of them, various things happening, you'll notice brightness, contrast, nothing's happened yet because I haven't adjusted. They're both at their neutral 0. So I'm going to click on auto to start here and see what happens. And you see it did a little bit. It added the contrast to 14 out of 100. So here's full contrast. So you see here, here's 0 or minus 50 of contrast, right? So you can see things getting duller, and then that's the neutral piece, right? Same thing with brightness. As I pull down, lose a lot of, gets really dark, you see in the image, and then bright, again, it pulls every value up. And this again itself could be an interesting sort of overlay to play with in your drawings, in your models, to almost make them look more like a drawing or projection. But for this purposes, I'm actually trying to get the detail of the model. So I might pull the brightness up a bit, let's say in the sort of 15 range, because this image itself is actually pretty, again, was pretty gray in the middle, kind of had that kind of between. And then I might pull, as I noticed in the auto setting, I might pull this up maybe even closer to 30 to really get a nice bump up of this shadow. So now this black against the sort of lighter colors really shows up. And then one of the last things I might play with is the levels. And the levels are really interesting because in the levels tool, right, I've got this 3 pieces in this slider histogram here, and then I've got these 2 down here, output versus input. And if you notice, if I pull the output, right, I'm actually dropping out the blacks. Right? So that's why it's getting lighter as I pull myself away from black. And you can imagine, conversely, that's why I'm getting darker as I pull down my white, right, and go across. So I'm going to keep the outputs the same right now, but instead I'm going to play with these midtones here. I'm going to see what it's like to actually pull some of these grays up or down. So if you see, if I go this way, it gets really dark and rich, but I do lose detail, and then I pick up a lot of the concrete's layer. So instead, I might come down just a hair, right? So here's my midpoint. I might pull myself down just a little bit. You can see it's impressive. And then here, same thing, right? Maybe pull this up a little bit, bring those blacks up just a hair, right? So let me go back to maybe 20. Yeah, somewhere in that 15 to 20 range. I think it looks pretty good in terms of like a composition, right? This thing starts to really see that crisp edge of this pyramidal tetrahedron sort of figure here. And then again, as I start to play with this, right, I can start to wash things back out because this got pulled up, right? So the middle value moves differently. But as I start to compose here, one of the things that's probably jumping out to a lot of you is there's still a lot of concrete in this field. So I can now go over here to my crop tool. And with my crop tool, I'm actually going to keep myself on my original ratio, because maybe I just want to play with the standard ratio coming out of the camera of my phone, which is a very conventional ratio on most smartphones. But one of the things I have here is when I keep original, you see the whole image transforms X and Y together, right? It stays in proportion. So as I pull in here, I might start to notice that, yeah, I get a little bit of a sort of focus now on the actual model and shadow, and I still get that texture of the concrete. Another thing I can do, though, as you see, is I can scale from any one of these lines in the corner, but also as I hover outside a corner, you see it switches from an angle pull-out to sort of a rotate icon, and that's exactly what it is. As I click, hold, I can now rotate this figure. So maybe one of the things I want to play with is either a full rotation at 45. So now I have this image, as you see, based on using the grids. I've got this triangle that's half a square kind of located in this image, right? So I get this line is defining the hypotenuse, and then these two edges, the square. So you can see I'm pretty close in this photograph. And as I start to crop in, maybe a little bit more, I can start to really focus on now how I want to use the center of that image to really define the intersection and then the edge of that across. So as I'm now in my active crop window, I just hit my enter or return key, and now I have cropped this image. And as we see based on certain elements here, I can always go back and overlay instead only my levels on the black and white. I can only overlay my brightness. I can only overlay my black and white. And so you can manipulate these layers, these masking layers on your image to get at certain values, but then you also have the base image to play with. So when I'm done here, I can save as, and in the save as, I can actually save it a TIFF file is what this came in as. I can save as TIFF, which allows for layers, or a lot of things you'll see for the most of your career when working with Photoshop. If you want to have layers and things preserved, you have a Photoshop file, right? So I might actually save this as frame plane, and maybe for the purposes of file management, 1, and .psd. So, and so now that I've saved this .psd, so with this PSD file, I now have the ability to keep these layers saved like this, moving forward, always return to it. And then the other thing I can do is I can also save a copy as a flattened image. And this is where you can have with the JPEG itself, if I save as a JPEG, it will flatten this image. It will save a copy. And so it's frame plane 1 because it's not going to be saved over. Saving a copy as a JPEG. And this will be a smaller file size, and also be flattened. Might be good for sort of placing in a larger portfolio, certain elements, because these PSD files can get pretty large moving forward. So in saving a copy now, I now have the ability to get my JPEG moving forward. And then last but not least, just to show you where we were, there's a history function that's been going on that's been tracking all of my changes along the way. Instead of using just as simple as just undo, you can actually work backwards. You saw I've manipulated layer visibility and I was playing with things, right? I can also go back to where I just started. So this is where we were when we first came in. Now, why would you do that? You might do that to sort of test something, come back. You might realize that you went too far with something, but the idea of taking a snapshot is also going to be really helpful. And we'll talk about that in a separate process video, but you can actually do snapshots as you perform things, right? But this is the last thing I did was I manipulated layer visibility, cropped, and now have saved a copy. So hope that helps as you start to tweak your model photos and become more authored and focused with your the composition of your images of your physical work and documentation. Thanks.